He was the pride of an empire, Prince Mustafa, born into greatness, raised on the battlefield, and destined to rule. Soldiers cheered his name. The people adored him. Even foreign ambassadors whispered, "He is the future of the Ottoman Empire." And yet, in the autumn of 1553, that future came to an end. The Ottoman army was deep in Persian territory. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent had summoned his eldest son, Mustafa, to his tent. To the court, it seemed like a normal meeting. Perhaps strategy, perhaps ceremony. But something felt off. Mustafa mounted his horse and rode through the camp. As he passed, soldiers stood tall. Some smiled. Others looked away, their faces tight with unspoken dread. They had heard the rumors, whispers of betrayal, of plots, of poisoned minds. But Mustafa, he showed no fear. He was calm, proud, like a man walking into battle, knowing it might be his last. Inside the tent, no one spoke. Then it happened. From the shadows, palace guards emerged, not with swords, but with silk, a long, thin cord, the executioner's tool of choice in the Ottoman court. Silent, clean, without blood, they wrapped it around Mustafa's neck, and as the golden prince collapsed to the floor, his legacy shattered with him. No trial, no protest, just silence. A prince walked into his father's tent, and never walked out. Prince Mustafa wasn't just a son of the empire. He was the son, the one everyone believed in, the one they whispered about with hope and fear. Born in 1515, he was the firstborn of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the greatest ruler the Ottoman Empire had ever seen. But even in childhood, Mustafa carried more than a name. He carried expectations. By the age of 16, he was already governing a province. By 20, he led men into battle. And they followed him, not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to. Mustafa was the kind of man empires are built on. Brave, just, intelligent, merciful. The soldiers loved him. The people adored him. And foreign powers watched him carefully, because they knew that when Suleiman died, this prince would rise. But in the Ottoman palace, perfection was dangerous, because perfection threatens power. And the Ottoman system had a rule. Only one son could inherit the throne. The rest, his own brothers, would be executed to prevent civil war. So while Mustafa's greatness dazzled the public, it cast long shadows inside the court. Behind the curtains, other eyes were watching, eyes filled with fear. Hurrem Sultan, the sultan's wife, Mustafa's stepmother, had her own sons. And she knew, if Mustafa became sultan, her children would die. And so whispers began. But Mustafa, he didn't whisper. He stood tall. He led armies into Persia and won. He walked through markets where people threw flowers at his feet. They chanted his name, Mustafa, Mustafa. Because somewhere deep within the sultan's heart, something was changing. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was jealousy. Or maybe it was fear that his beloved son was no longer his, but the empire's. He had raised a lion, and now that lion was growing too strong. In time, Suleiman stopped praising his son. Their letters became cold. Invitations to court stopped. Mustafa was kept far away from the capital, from the throne, from his father's gaze. But even then, the people waited for him. They believed that one day, the Golden Prince would return and rule justly. They didn't know that the closer you got to the throne in the Ottoman Empire, the more likely it was to become your grave. But there was a problem, a quiet, deadly problem dressed in silk and hidden behind the perfume of power. Her name was Hurrem Sultan. She wasn't just the sultan's consort. She was his wife, his confidant, the mother of several of his sons. And above all, she was ambitious. Hurrem had risen from a slave girl in the harem to the most powerful woman in the Ottoman Empire. She knew how the palace worked. She knew how men thought. And she understood one unspoken truth. In the Ottoman dynasty, love meant nothing. Blood did. According to the law of succession, when a new sultan came to power, his brothers would be executed immediately. It wasn't cruelty. It was control. A brutal system meant to prevent civil war. And it had worked. So if Mustafa, the eldest, the firstborn, the perfect heir, took the throne, Hurrem's sons would be next in line for the noose, and she would lose everything. But Hurrem wasn't the type to wait around and see what fate decided. She would shape it herself. She turned to the only man who could help her carry out what would become one of the most dangerous political operations in Ottoman history, Rustam Pasha, her son-in-law. Married to her daughter Miraima, Rustam was Grand Vizier, the second most powerful man in the empire, and loyal to Hurrem, not to Mustafa. The whispers began slowly, carefully. Mustafa is too ambitious. He's gathering troops without his father's consent. He dreams of the throne before Suleiman dies. But whispers weren't enough. So Rustam and Hurrem took it further. They forged letters, supposedly from Mustafa to the Shah of Persia, detailing a treasonous plan to overthrow his father. The letters were planted carefully, leaked intentionally, and they reached the only man who mattered, Sultan Suleiman. No words are spoken, but his face darkens. Was it real? Did he believe it? Or had decades of ruling and paranoia taught him one lesson too well? Kill before you are killed. No one knows for certain what Suleiman thought in those moments. Historians still debate it. But what is clear is this. After that night, Suleiman stopped speaking of his son with warmth. In his eyes, Mustafa was no longer heir. He was threat. Meanwhile, outside the palace, the people still cheered Mustafa's name. The soldiers still swore loyalty to him. But inside, the walls were closing in. Slowly, quietly. Hurrem watched from the shadows. Rustam moved the pieces. And Mustafa, he had no idea what was coming. Because when the empire decides your fate, it never speaks aloud. It just whispers. Until those whispers become a rope. The order was given in silence. No public trial. No formal accusation. Just a message from father to son. In 1553, the Ottoman army was deep in Persian territory. Sultan Suleiman had pitched his imperial tent near the town of Konya, preparing for war. The campaign had stalled, and tensions were high. But beneath the surface, something far darker was unfolding, something far more personal. Prince Mustafa was summoned. No explanation, no warning, just a request, come to your father's tent. To outsiders, it seemed routine. A simple meeting between the Sultan and his son, the commander of the Eastern forces. But those who knew. The palace had gone quiet. Rustam Pasha had left camp, claiming illness. The guards at Suleiman's tent had changed. The air was heavy. Still. And yet, Mustafa came. He could have refused. He had loyal soldiers, tens of thousands of them. If he had raised the alarm, they would have followed him. They would have fought for him. But he didn't. Maybe he still trusted his father. Maybe he didn't want to believe the rumors. Or maybe he was too noble to run from fate. Inside the tent, silence. No advisors. No family. No candles burning. Just shadows. As Mustafa stepped in, the curtains fell shut behind him. And from the darkness, they appeared. The mute executioners. Chosen for their strength and their silence. They didn't speak. They didn't draw blades. They carried only a single object, a long, smooth silk cord. The symbol of royal execution. Bloodless. Dignified. Designed not to stain the throne. They wrapped it around his neck. Mustafa struggled, but not like a man trying to escape. Like a man trying to breathe just a few seconds longer. His final moments weren't filled with screaming or pleading. Just gasps. Just the soft creak of silk tightening around his throat. A sound that would haunt the empire forever. And then nothing. Clapperboard visual, slow motion. Mustafa's feet lift slightly from the ground. Then drop. The cord still taut. The tent quiet. Outside no one dared speak. But the whispers had stopped. The perfect prince was dead. By morning, his body was carried out, wrapped in linen. There was no ceremony. No honor guard. Only a shallow grave and a broken empire. Because what died that day wasn't just a man. It was trust. It was hope. It was the belief that even a just prince could survive the politics of the throne. Suleiman never spoke of that day. Not in public. Not in court. But something inside him changed. And for the rest of his life, he visited Mustafa's tomb in secret. Alone. No guards. No fanfare. Clapperboard visual. An old Suleiman standing in front of a tomb. He places one trembling hand on the stone, then turns, then walks away, shadow swallowing him whole. History records this as a necessary act, but history doesn't carry guilt. Only people do. And for the greatest ruler the empire had ever seen, the murder of his son was a crown far heavier than gold. The news spread like wildfire, but no one dared speak it aloud. Prince Mustafa gone, executed by order of his own father. The golden heir, the people's champion, the soldiers' beloved commander, was dead. And with him, something inside the empire broke. In the army camps, disbelief turned to sorrow. Veterans who had once marched proudly behind Mustafa now wept in silence. Many refused to eat. Others abandoned the campaign altogether. To them, he wasn't just a prince, he was their future, their hope for a just and glorious empire. And now, he was just a name whispered through tears. Inside the palace, things were no better. Suleiman returned to Constantinople victorious in battle, but hollow in spirit. People bowed deeper, spoke softer, but not out of respect, out of fear. Because if the Sultan could order his own son's death, who was safe? Even Suleiman's court grew cold. He no longer hosted music, no longer joined celebrations. Those who once saw him as the magnificent now saw a shadow of the man he had been. And though no one ever questioned him directly, the eyes of the people said everything. Why? Had he been lied to? Had he been manipulated? Or had he simply chosen power over blood? In his final years, Suleiman was often seen visiting Mustafa's tomb in Bursa. No guards, no attendants, just a grieving father in silence. He had ruled over millions, conquered cities, defeated kings. But in the end, he couldn't conquer doubt or grief. And though his empire would survive for centuries, many believe it was in that tent, in that single act, that the soul of the Ottoman dynasty began to rot. Because empires don't die in battlefields. They die in silence. So, who really betrayed Prince Mustafa? History points its finger at many. The most obvious is Hurrem Sultan, his stepmother. She had motive. She had means. And she had everything to lose if Mustafa took the throne. Her sons, Selim, Bayezid Sahangir, would be marked for death the moment the Golden Prince wore the crown. To protect them, she had to strike first. And she did it not with a sword, but with whispers. Then there's Rustam Pasha, Hurrem's puppet, or perhaps a mastermind in his own right. He forged letters, fabricated rumors, and manipulated the Sultan's fear. He played the empire like a chessboard. And Mustafa? Just a piece to remove. But there's another name, one more painful to consider. Suleiman, the father, the ruler, the man who signed the order. Was he deceived? Or did he know the truth, and choose betrayal anyway? Some historians say Suleiman wanted to believe the lies, that in his old age, surrounded by schemers, he grew paranoid, convinced that even his most beloved son might one day turn against him. Others say it was politics, that Mustafa had become too popular, too independent. The military adored him, the people worshipped him, and no empire survives when its ruler is outshined by his heir. So maybe it wasn't about justice. Maybe it was about control. There are even darker theories. Some claim Suleiman knew everything and allowed it to happen, that he understood the whispers were lies, but did nothing, because the empire needed stability, not love, not legacy, just survival. And Mustafa, he was simply too perfect, too righteous, too adored, too dangerous for those who had learned to rule through fear, not admiration. Studio microphone narrator, quietly. They said he would be the greatest sultan the empire had ever known. And maybe that's why he had to die. Mustafa was buried without ceremony, without songs, without mourning. But he was never forgotten. His tomb became a silent monument, not to power, but to tragedy. A reminder that in the Ottoman Empire, greatness was a double-edged sword. And the closer you got to the throne, the sharper it became. Because in the end, the question isn't who betrayed Mustafa. The real question is, can an empire built on blood ever escape its own shadow?